The fluorescent lights of that church room hummed the same way they always did. I had sat in dozens of these councils before, always on the same side of the table, always wearing the same dark suit, always carrying the same quiet certainty that I was doing God's work. But I had no idea that in less than a month I would be the one whose faith would be on trial, not in front of a council, but alone, at 3 a.m., discovering that everything I had defended for 42 years was built on sand. The young man sitting across from us was named Tyler Erickson, 28 years old, a professor of religious history at a community college in Orem. He had been a member his entire life, served a mission in Brazil, married in the Provo Temple, taught early morning seminary to teenagers for 3 years. On paper, he was everything the church wanted. In reality, he was about to be erased. I watched him from my seat at the right hand of Bishop Morrison. My calling as first counselor in the bishopric meant I had participated in disciplinary councils before. I had seen men weep, beg, bargain. I had seen women collapse under the weight of confession. I had seen teenagers tremble as they admitted sins they had been taught to consider unforgivable. But Tyler was different. He sat with his back straight, his hands folded calmly on the table, his eyes clear and steady. He looked like a man who had already made peace with whatever was coming. The charges against him were apostasy. He had been reported by a fellow ward member for sharing anti-Mormon literature with a colleague at work. When confronted by his stake president, Tyler had not denied it. He had not apologized. He had simply said, "I shared historical documents, primary sources, many of them from the church's own archives. If truth is anti-Mormon, then we have a problem." That statement had sealed his fate. Bishop Morrison read the formal charges. Tyler listened without expression. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he shook his head slowly. "I'm not here to defend myself," he said. "I'm here because you need to do this. I understand. The institution requires it." There was something in his voice that unsettled me. Not anger, not bitterness. Something closer to compassion, as if he pitied us for what we were about to do. I shifted in my seat and reminded myself that this was a man who had lost his way, who had allowed Satan to deceive him through the philosophies of men. I had seen it before. Intellectuals who thought they knew better than prophets. Academics who trusted historical documents more than spiritual witnesses. Pride was the great destroyer, and Tyler Erickson had clearly let pride consume him. The council deliberated for less than 20 minutes. The decision was unanimous. Tyler Erickson was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, effective immediately. His temple blessings were revoked. His priesthood was void. In the eyes of the church, he was now spiritually equivalent to someone who had never been baptized. 40 years of membership, erased in an afternoon. When Bishop Morrison read the decision, Tyler nodded once. He started to rise from his chair, and I thought that was the end of it. But then he paused. He turned and looked directly at me, not at the bishop, not at the stake president who had joined us, but at me specifically. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "Brother Ballard," he said, "can I ask you one question before I go?" I glanced at Bishop Morrison, who gave a slight shrug. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my voice steady. Tyler took a step closer to the table. "Have you ever read the Gospel Topics essays on the church's official website? Have you ever actually studied what Joseph Smith did? Not what we teach in Sunday school, but what the church itself now admits in its own published essays." I felt a flash of irritation. This was a classic tactic of apostates, trying to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the faithful. "I'm familiar with the essays," I said, though in truth I had only skimmed 1 or 2 of them years ago. "They provide context for complex historical issues. They strengthen testimony, not weaken it." Tyler smiled, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was sad, almost gentle. "I used to say the same thing," he said, word for word, before I actually read them. He turned and walked toward the door. Just before he stepped out, he looked back one more time. "I hope you never have to go through what I went through, Brother Ballard. But if you do, if you ever have the courage to actually look, I hope you find your way to the other side." The door closed behind him. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Bishop Morrison cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "that was unfortunately typical. The adversary always tries to spread doubt, even in his final moments here." The stake president nodded in agreement. We said a closing prayer. We shook hands. We went home to our families. I kissed Linda when I walked through the door. She was preparing dinner, the smell of roast beef filling the kitchen, and she asked how the council had gone. "Sad," I said, which was my standard answer. She nodded sympathetically and returned to her cooking. We had been married for 31 years. She knew not to ask for details about church disciplinary matters. That night I sat in my home office supposedly reviewing spreadsheets for my job at BYU. But my mind kept returning to Tyler Erickson's face. That calm, that certainty. He had just lost everything. His membership, his community, probably his marriage if his wife was a faithful member. And yet he had looked at me with something resembling peace. How was that possible? How could someone who had just been spiritually condemned appear more at ease than I felt right now? I told myself it was the counterfeit peace of the deceived. Satan was a master of imitation, and those who followed him often felt a false sense of liberation before the true consequences of their choices caught up with them. Tyler Erickson would realize his mistake eventually. They always did. But his question kept echoing in my mind. Have you ever read the Gospel Topics essays? Have you ever actually studied what Joseph Smith did? Of course I had studied Joseph Smith. I had read the approved biographies, the church manuals, the ensign articles. I had taught lessons about him in priesthood meeting, borne testimony of him in fast and testimony meeting, defended him in conversations with curious non-members. Joseph Smith was the prophet of the Restoration, the man through whom God had brought back the fullness of the gospel to the earth. I knew everything I needed to know about him. Didn't I? 3 weeks passed. Life continued as normal. I conducted interviews with youth preparing for missions. I sat on the stand during sacrament meeting. I attended temple sessions with Linda. I played with my grandchildren when my married children brought them over for Sunday dinner. Everything was exactly as it had always been, except that Tyler Erickson's question would not leave me alone. It surfaced at odd moments, during a hymn, during a prayer, during the silent moments before sleep. Have you ever actually studied what Joseph Smith did? The question felt like a splinter lodged somewhere I couldn't reach. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was allowing an apostate's final words to occupy too much space in my mind. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more persistent it became. One Thursday evening, Linda told me she was driving to Salt Lake to spend the weekend with our daughter Megan, who had just had her third baby. I helped her load her suitcase into the car, kissed her goodbye, and watched her drive away. The house felt unusually quiet. I made myself a simple dinner, watched the news, and then retreated to my office. I sat at my desk and stared at the computer screen. The cursor blinked patiently. Just to prove Tyler wrong, I told myself. Just to confirm what I already know. I'll read the Gospel Topics essays properly, see that they're perfectly faith-affirming, and finally put this ridiculous doubt to rest. I opened the browser and typed, Gospel Topics Essays, LDS. The first result was the official church website. I clicked on it. The page loaded, showing a list of essays on various topics. Book of Mormon translation, plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, race and the priesthood, Book of Abraham translation, first vision accounts. I had vaguely known these essays existed. They had been published quietly several years ago, but I had never sat down to read them carefully. There had never seemed to be a need. I already had a testimony. Why go looking for complexity? I clicked on Book of Mormon translation. The essay began innocuously enough, discussing how Joseph Smith was called by God to translate an ancient record. But as I read further, I encountered something that made me pause. The essay described how Joseph often used a seer stone to translate, placing the stone in a hat and burying his face in the hat to block out external light. The words would appear on the stone, and Joseph would dictate them to his scribe. I read that paragraph 3 times. A stone in a hat. His face buried in the hat. The actual golden plates often not even in the room during the translation process. This was not what I had been taught. For 42 years, I had seen artwork depicting Joseph studying the golden plates directly, running his fingers over the ancient characters, using the Urim and Thummim attached to a breastplate. That image was in every church manual, every primary classroom, every visitor's center. But here, on the church's own website, was a very different description. I scrolled down, looking for some explanation, some context that would make this fit with what I had always believed. The essay acknowledged that this method is not fully understood, but confirmed it was historically documented by multiple witnesses, including Joseph's wife Emma. My chest felt tight. I told myself to stay calm. This was just one detail, one minor aspect of a complex historical event. It didn't change the fundamental truth of the Book of Mormon. It didn't mean Joseph wasn't a prophet, but a small voice in my mind whispered, if this is what they didn't tell me about something so basic, what else didn't they tell me? I clicked on Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. The essay opened with an acknowledgement that Joseph Smith had married multiple wives, between 30 and 40 women, the exact number uncertain. Some of these marriages were to women who were already legally married to other living men. Some were to young women, including one who was 14 years old. I felt the room tilt slightly. 14 years old. I thought of my granddaughter, Emily. She had just turned 14. The idea of a 37-year-old man, any man, let alone a prophet, marrying someone her age made my stomach turn. The essay explained that these marriages were eternity-only sealings in some cases, that they were part of the restoration of all things, including Old Testament practices. It mentioned that Joseph initially kept plural marriage secret, even from Emma, his first wife. Secret marriages, teenage brides, other men's wives. I pushed back from my desk and stood up. My legs felt unsteady. I walked to the window and stared out at the quiet street, the neat lawns, the other houses where other faithful families were going about their Thursday evenings. Did they know this? Had everyone always known this except me? No, that wasn't possible. I had been in the church my entire life. I had attended 4 years of seminary, 4 years of institute, served a mission in Argentina, held leadership callings for decades. If this information had been commonly taught, I would have encountered it somewhere along the way. Someone would have mentioned it, which meant it had been hidden or at least not emphasized. The church had chosen to present a certain version of Joseph Smith to its members, the faithful husband, the devoted prophet, the martyr, while keeping these other details buried in historical archives that most members would never access. But now, they were publishing it, on their own website. Why? I returned to my desk and kept reading. The essay mentioned that some of Joseph's plural marriages were likely for eternity only, and did not involve sexual relations. But it also acknowledged that others were full marriages in every sense. The essay quoted historical sources, diaries, letters. It was not anti-Mormon propaganda. It was the church itself, finally admitting what historians had been saying for decades. I thought about all the lessons I had taught, all the testimonies I had borne, all the times I had told investigators and doubting members that accusations against Joseph Smith were lies spread by enemies of the church. I had been so certain, so confident in my righteous defense of the prophet, and I had been defending a version of him that the church itself now admitted was incomplete. The clock on my desk showed 11:47 p.m. I had been reading for over 3 hours. I should stop. I should go to bed. I should pray and ask God to help me understand, to give me peace, to strengthen my testimony. But I couldn't stop. There was a phrase Tyler had used, what Joseph Smith actually did. The Gospel Topics essays had shown me some of it, but I sensed there was more. The essays were carefully worded, designed to acknowledge problems while minimizing their impact. What would I find if I looked beyond the official sources? My hands were trembling slightly as I typed into the search bar, CES Letter PDF. I had heard of the CES Letter. Every active member who spent time online had heard of it. It was described as a dangerous document, a sophisticated attack on the church written by a man who had lost his faith. Church leaders warned against reading it. Faithful members spoke of it in hushed tones, the way you might speak of a spiritual contagion. But Tyler had read it. Tyler had been at peace. The PDF loaded on my screen. It was long, nearly 100 pages. The author was a man named Jeremy Runnels, a lifelong member who had compiled his questions and concerns in a letter to a church education system director, hoping for answers. The answers never came, and eventually, Jeremy was excommunicated too. I began to read. The CES letter was not what I expected. It was not angry or mocking. It was methodical, almost gentle in its presentation. And it was thoroughly sourced, not with anti-Mormon websites or bitter ex-member testimonies, but with the church's own documents, the Journal of Discourses, historical records, even the Gospel Topics essays I had just read. The first section dealt with the Book of Mormon. Jeremy outlined dozens of anachronisms, things that appeared in the Book of Mormon that could not have existed in pre-Columbian America: horses, cattle, wheat, steel, chariots. The DNA evidence showing that Native Americans were descended from Asian populations, not Israelites. The striking similarities between the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews, a book published in Joseph Smith's area just a few years before the Book of Mormon. The identical errors shared between the Book of Mormon and Joseph's family Bible, suggesting he had copied passages directly. I wanted to argue against each point. I searched my mind for the apologetic responses I had heard over the years. Horses could have been tapirs. Steel could have been a mistranslation. The similarities were coincidental, but the weight of it all was crushing. Each individual problem might have an explanation, however strained. But together they formed a pattern that became harder and harder to ignore. The next section dealt with the Book of Abraham. I knew the basic story. Joseph had purchased Egyptian papyri from a traveling exhibition and translated them into a book of scripture revealing the teachings of Abraham. But the CES letter showed what happened when modern Egyptologists examined the surviving papyri. They were common funerary texts, the same documents buried with countless Egyptian mummies. They contained no mention of Abraham whatsoever. The characters Joseph claimed to translate did not say what he claimed they said. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. The room seemed to be getting smaller. The letter moved on to the multiple accounts of the first vision. I had always been taught that Joseph Smith's first vision, in which God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him in a grove of trees, was a singular, consistent event that Joseph recounted faithfully throughout his life. But the CES letter presented the different versions Joseph had written or dictated over the years. In the earliest account, written in 1832, Joseph mentioned only seeing the Lord, singular, not plural. In later accounts, the details grew more elaborate. Two personages became standard only years later. The reasons for the vision shifted. The age at which it occurred varied. I had never known there were multiple versions. No one had ever mentioned this in any class, any manual, any conference talk. Why? The clock now showed 2:17 a.m. My eyes burned, my neck ached, but I couldn't stop reading. The CES letter documented false prophecies made by Joseph Smith, specific predictions that had not come true. It showed how fundamental doctrines had changed over time, from the nature of God to the requirements for salvation. It detailed the circumstances around plural marriage more explicitly than the church essays had, including the pressure tactics Joseph used, the promises of salvation for families who complied, the threat of destruction for those who refused. And it all came from church sources, diaries of apostles, Official histories. The words of Joseph Smith himself. By 3:30 a.m., I was on the floor. I don't remember sliding off my chair. I just found myself there on the carpet, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing in circles that led nowhere. Every foundation I had built my life upon was crumbling. Every certainty was dissolving into questions. I felt like I was falling through the floor, through the earth itself, into some void where nothing was solid anymore. I tried to pray. I formed the words in my mind, Heavenly Father. But they felt hollow, like speaking to an empty room. For 54 years, I had believed someone was listening. Now I wasn't sure there was anyone there at all. I thought about Linda, asleep in Salt Lake City, unaware that her husband was lying on the floor of his office, watching his faith disintegrate. I thought about our children, David, Sarah, Megan, Daniel, all raised in the church, all married in the temple, all building their lives on the same foundation that was crumbling beneath me. If I told them what I had discovered, what would happen? Would they believe me? Would they hate me? I thought about my parents, both dead now, who had sacrificed everything for the church. My father had served as a bishop, a stake president, a temple worker. My mother had raised 7 children on a modest income while paying a full tithe. They had died with absolute certainty that they would be together forever in the celestial kingdom. Had they been wrong? Had their entire lives been built on lies? And the ancestors, the ones who had pushed handcarts across a frozen continent, who had buried children in shallow graves along the trail, who had given everything, health, wealth, life itself, to reach Zion. My great-great-grandmother Sarah Ann Richards had walked 1,300 miles with a broken foot because she believed. She had believed so completely that she endured unimaginable suffering. For what? For a religion started by a man who married teenagers and other men's wives? For a book translated by staring into a hat? For a church that had hidden its own history from its own members for nearly 2 centuries? I heard a sound and realized it was coming from me, a low moan, half grief and half terror. I was 54 years old. I had been a faithful member for 42 of those years, and in one night, in a few hours of reading, it had all come apart. The first gray light of dawn was seeping through the window when I finally pulled myself off the floor. I sat in my chair and stared at the computer screen, still showing a page from the CES Letter. My eyes felt like sandpaper. My head throbbed. I felt hungover, though I hadn't touched alcohol in my life. I heard the garage door open. Linda, back early. I looked at the clock, 6:23 a.m. She wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday. Why was she back? I heard her footsteps in the hallway, heard her voice calling out cheerfully, "Richard, honey, I'm home. Megan was doing so well I decided to come back early. Are you up?" I looked at myself in the small mirror on the wall of my office. My eyes were red and swollen. My face was pale. I looked like someone who had been crying for hours. Because I had been. I quickly closed the browser tabs one after another, erasing the evidence of my night of destruction. I ran my hands through my hair, tried to compose my face into something resembling normalcy. "Richard?" Linda's voice was closer now. "Are you in your office?" "Yes," I said, and my voice came out hoarse and strange. Just working on some things. I'll be out in a minute." I heard her pause outside the door. "Are you okay? You sound odd." "Just a headache," I said. "Didn't sleep well." A moment of silence. Then, "Okay. I'll make some breakfast. Come out when you're ready." Her footsteps retreated down the hall. I sat there staring at the blank screen, my heart pounding. I had no idea how I was going to face her, how I was going to face anyone. Everything looked the same, the office, the house, the rising sun outside the window. But I was no longer the same person who had sat down at this desk 12 hours ago. That man had believed. That man had been certain. That man had known exactly who he was and where he was going. I didn't know anything anymore. The smell of bacon drifted down the hallway. Linda was making my favorite breakfast, the same one she had made every Saturday morning for 3 decades. The normalcy of it felt obscene, like someone playing cheerful music at a funeral. I splashed water on my face in the bathroom, tried to make my eyes look less swollen. The man in the mirror stared back at me with an expression I didn't recognize. He looked older than he had yesterday, hollowed out. "You look terrible," Linda said when I finally emerged into the kitchen. She was standing at the stove, spatula in hand, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail. At 53, she was still beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth. The beauty of a life lived with conviction, of certainty worn like comfortable clothing. "Are you coming down with something?" "Maybe," I said. "Didn't sleep much." She crossed the kitchen and pressed her palm against my forehead, the way she had done with our children when they were small. "No fever. You're probably just exhausted. You've been working too hard." She kissed my cheek and returned to the stove. "Sit down, eat something. You'll feel better." I sat at the kitchen table and watched her move around the room, cracking eggs, flipping bacon, pouring orange juice. Every gesture was familiar, practiced, part of a routine we had established decades ago. This was the life we had built together. Temple marriage, 4 children raised in the gospel, callings served faithfully, retirement approaching with plans to serve a mission together. It was a good life, a righteous life, and it was built on a foundation I no longer believed in. She set a plate in front of me. Eggs, bacon, toast with strawberry jam. I stared at it without appetite. "How's Megan?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal. "And the baby?" "Wonderful. Little Joseph is sleeping through the night already. Can you believe it? Megan says he's the easiest of all 3. Linda sat across from me with her own plate. "She's such a good mother. I'm so proud of her." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Little Joseph, named after the prophet, named after a man who had married a 14-year-old girl. "Are you sure you're okay?" Linda was studying me now. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You seem distant." "Just tired," I said. "Really?" She didn't look convinced, but she let it drop. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Don't forget we have the temple session this afternoon," she said. "The Hendersons are saving us seats." The temple, where we dressed in ceremonial clothing and performed rituals that now seemed strange and arbitrary, where we made covenants to consecrate everything, our time, our talents, our very lives, to the church. I had been through the temple hundreds of times. I had performed proxy baptisms, endowments, sealings. I had believed that the words spoken in those rooms had the power to bind families together for eternity. Now those rituals felt like something from a fever dream. "Actually," I said, "I might skip today. This headache." Linda's expression shifted. In 31 years of marriage, I had never voluntarily missed a temple session. We went every week without fail. It was a cornerstone of our marriage, a commitment we had made when we were sealed. "Richard." Her voice was careful now. "What's going on?" "Nothing. I just need to rest." "You never miss temple." "Never." She set down her fork. "Something happened while I was gone." "What is it?" I looked at her, my wife of 3 decades, the mother of my children, the woman who had stood beside me through every calling, every move, every trial. I loved her more than I had ever loved anyone, and I was about to devastate her. But I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until I understood it myself. Not until I found some way to make sense of the chaos inside my head. "I've just been doing some reading," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Some research." "For a talk I'm preparing." "What kind of research?" "Church history, early church history. It's raised some questions." Linda relaxed slightly. Oh, that. Yes, I know some of the history is messy. That's why we have living prophets to guide us. You shouldn't let yourself get too deep into that stuff. It only leads to confusion. I stared at her. You know about it? About the difficult parts? I know enough. She picked up her fork again and resumed eating. Sister Harrison in Relief Society went through something similar a few years ago. She got too caught up in reading things online, started questioning everything. But she talked to the bishop, did some fasting and praying, and her testimony came back stronger than ever. Sometimes we have to put things on the shelf and trust that the Lord will explain it all in His time. The shelf. I had heard that phrase countless times. It was the faithful member's strategy for dealing with contradictions and uncomfortable facts. You put them on a mental shelf, trusted that someday the answers would come, and continued living your life in obedience. For 42 years, I had kept that shelf carefully organized, never examining its contents too closely. Last night, the shelf had collapsed. Maybe you're right, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. Linda smiled, relieved. I know I am. Now finish your breakfast. We can skip the temple today if you need to rest, but let's plan on going next Saturday. And maybe you should talk to Bishop Morrison. He's a wise man. He can help you work through whatever is bothering you. I nodded and forced myself to eat. The bacon tasted like ash. The following weeks were an exercise in concealment. I went to church every Sunday, sat on the stand with the other bishopric members, sang the hymns, bowed my head for the prayers. I conducted worthiness interviews with teenagers, asking them the standard questions about their testimonies and their adherence to the law of chastity. I bore my testimony in fast and testimony meeting, mouthing words about the truthfulness of the gospel that no longer felt true. Every moment was a performance. Every word was a lie. At night, when Linda was asleep, I would slip into my office and continue my research. I read Fair Mormon, the church's unofficial apologetic website, searching for answers to the questions that plagued me. Sometimes I found partial responses, explanations that made a certain kind of sense if you squinted at them from the right angle. But for every answer I found, 3 new questions emerged. The apologetics felt like trying to plug holes in a dam with chewing gum. The pressure kept building. I discovered Mormon Stories, a podcast hosted by a former member named John Dellin. I listened to hundreds of hours of interviews with people who had left the church, their stories of discovery, doubt, departure, and rebuilding. I heard my own experience reflected in their words, felt less alone knowing that thousands of others had walked this same path. But I also heard what happened to them, the marriages that ended, the families that shattered, the careers destroyed, the loneliness and grief that followed the loss of community. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't sure I would ever be ready. One night I found myself on a website called Mormon Think, reading about the different accounts of the first vision. There was a chart showing the variations between versions, who appeared, what they said, when it happened, why Joseph went to the grove in the first place. The earliest account, written by Joseph himself in 1832, described seeing only the Lord. Later accounts added the Father as a separate personage. Details multiplied over time, as if the story were growing more elaborate with each retelling. I thought about my own mission. I had taught investigators that Joseph Smith's first vision was the foundational event of the restoration, a clear and consistent account of God and Jesus Christ appearing to a young boy. I had promised them that if they prayed about it, they would receive a spiritual witness of its truth. Had I been teaching them something that was, at best, a simplified version of a much more complicated reality? At worst, had I been teaching them something that might not have happened at all? The thought made me physically ill. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the silence of the house. Linda was asleep upstairs. My children were in their own homes, tucking their own children into bed, probably saying prayers about Heavenly Father and Jesus and Joseph Smith. They had no idea that their father was drowning, And I couldn't tell them. I couldn't bear to see the look in their eyes, the disappointment, the fear, the judgment. They had been raised to believe that people who left the church were deceived by Satan, overcome by pride, or simply too weak to keep the commandments. If I told them what I had discovered, they would assume the same about me. I wasn't weak. I wasn't deceived. I had simply done what the scriptures commanded. I had studied it out in my mind, examined the evidence, sought for truth with real intent, and the truth I found was not the truth I had been taught. But how do you explain that to people who have been programmed from birth to interpret doubt as sin? The Sunday dinner tradition had been a fixture of our family for nearly 20 years. Every week, our children and their families gathered at our house for a meal after church. Linda spent Saturday preparing her famous pot roast, homemade rolls, 3 kinds of pie. The grandchildren ran through the house while the adults talked about callings and conference talks and the small details of their carefully constructed Mormon lives. I used to love these dinners. The noise, the chaos, the sense of continuity. 4 generations of Ballards, all faithful, all sealed together for eternity. It was everything I had worked for. Now it felt like a performance I had to survive. 3 weeks after my night of research, I sat at the head of the table and watched my family eat. David, my oldest, was talking about his elders' quorum presidency. Sarah was showing Linda pictures of the nursery she was decorating for her 4th child. Daniel was helping his 5-year-old son memorize an article of faith. Megan was quieter than usual, nursing baby Joseph under a blanket while her husband discussed his stake calling. Everyone was so certain, so comfortable in their certainty. I caught Megan's eye across the table, and something in her expression made me pause. She looked tired, more tired than a new mother should look. And there was something else in her face, something that might have been sadness or doubt or simple exhaustion. She looked away quickly. "Dad." David's voice broke into my thoughts. "Dad? Are you listening?" I blinked. "Sorry, what?" "I was asking about the stake conference. Are you speaking?" "No, not this time, just attending." David nodded and resumed his conversation with Daniel. I returned to pushing food around my plate, trying to look like I was eating. "Dad, can you help me understand something?" The voice was Megan's. She was looking at me now, her expression uncertain. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "The polygamy thing. A coworker asked me about it and I didn't know what to say. She'd read something online about Joseph Smith having lots of wives, some of them really young. I told her it was anti-Mormon lies, but then she showed me something on the church's website, the Gospel Topics Essays, and I didn't know what to say." The table went quiet. Everyone was looking at me now. David with a slight frown, Sarah with concern, Linda with something that might have been warning. I should have given the standard response. Historical context, different times, mysteries that will be explained in the hereafter. I had given that response 100 times. But the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. "The essays exist," I said carefully. "They acknowledge that Joseph practiced plural marriage. It's part of our history." "But she was 14, Megan said, her voice smaller now. "Helen Mar Kimball. I looked it up. She was 14 years old. I have students that age. She was a child." "Megan." Linda's voice was sharp. "This isn't appropriate dinner conversation. The children are listening. They can't understand what we're talking about." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Mom?" I asked Dad a question I want to understand. I looked at my daughter, intelligent, thoughtful, raised to believe that truth was the highest virtue, and I felt something crack inside me. She was asking the same questions I had asked. She was looking at the same evidence. And she deserved an honest answer. But what was the honest answer? I didn't know anymore. I didn't know anything. "I don't know, Megan." The words came out before I could stop them. "I'm not sure I believe any of it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the grandchildren stopped their fidgeting, sensing something significant in the air. Linda's face had gone white. "Richard." "I've been doing research," I said, and now that I had started, I couldn't stop. The dam had broken. The words poured out. "For weeks now. Not anti-Mormon lies. The Church's own documents. The Gospel Topics essays, the Joseph Smith papers, historical records, and what I found, I can't unsee it, I can't make it fit anymore." David pushed back from the table. "What are you saying, Dad?" "I'm saying I have doubts. Serious doubts. About Joseph Smith, about the Book of Mormon, about all of it." "You're being deceived." David's voice was hard. "This is exactly what the adversary does. He targets people in leadership, tries to bring them down." "It's not deception, David. It's information. Primary sources, the Church's own admissions. The Church hasn't admitted anything wrong. Those essays provide context. They strengthen testimony if you approach them with faith. I approached them with faith. For 42 years, I approached everything with faith. And now I'm approaching it with honesty, and the two don't fit together anymore." Sarah stood up abruptly, gathering her children. "We need to go. The kids have school tomorrow." "Sarah, wait. I can't listen to this." She was crying now. "You're my father. You're supposed to be an example. And you're sitting here saying the Church isn't true?" "I'm saying I don't know. That's all. I'm saying I have questions." "Questions are fine. Doubt is fine. But you're not doubting. You're denying. That's apostasy." The word hung in the air like a curse. Apostasy. The worst sin a Mormon could commit. The sin I had helped excommunicate Tyler Erickson for just weeks ago. Sarah left without saying goodbye, her husband following with their children. Daniel stood uncertainly, looking between me and Linda. Finally, he gathered his own family and headed for the door, pausing only to say, "I'll pray for you, Dad." Only Megan remained, sitting frozen in her chair with baby Joseph in her arms. Linda was crying silently, her hands pressed to her face. "I think you should leave," Linda said, her voice muffled by her palms. "Linda, I can't look at you right now. I need time to think. I'm still the same person I was this morning." She dropped her hands and stared at me, her eyes red and swollen. "No, you're not. The man I married believed in the gospel. The man I married had a testimony. I don't know who you are." I looked at Megan, hoping for something, understanding, support, anything. But she just shook her head slowly, stood, and walked out of the room without a word. That night I slept on the sofa in my office. The house that had been my sanctuary for 25 years now felt like enemy territory. I lay in the dark, listening to Linda sob in our bedroom, and wondered how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Have you ever felt trapped between who you were supposed to be and who you really are? I had spent 54 years being who I was supposed to be, the faithful son, the diligent missionary, the devoted husband, the righteous priesthood leader. I had followed every rule, checked every box, built a life that any Mormon would envy. And now I was discovering that beneath all those roles, I didn't know who I actually was. The following morning, Linda spoke to me in clipped, businesslike sentences. She was going to see Bishop Morrison. She expected me to be there too. This was something that could be fixed with proper spiritual guidance. I agreed to go because I didn't know what else to do. Bishop Morrison's office was small and windowless, decorated with pictures of temples and a portrait of the current prophet. He was a dentist by profession, a kind man who had served in the bishopric with me for 3 years. He had no training in counseling, no expertise in religious crisis, but in the Mormon structure, he was my spiritual authority. He held the keys to my salvation. He listened patiently as Linda described the dinner, the things I had said, her fears about our marriage and our eternal family. Occasionally he nodded or made notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he turned to me. "Richard, tell me what you're experiencing," I told him. The research, the questions, the collapse of everything I thought I knew. I tried to be honest without being aggressive, to express doubt without attacking the church. But even as I spoke, I could see his expression closing down. He was categorizing me, filing me away in the mental drawer labeled faith crisis or apostasy or needs help. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I appreciate your honesty, Richard. It takes courage to admit when we're struggling. But I want you to consider something. Satan is real. He knows that strong testimony bearers like yourself are valuable targets. And one of his most effective tools is information, true information even, but presented in a way that undermines faith." "I've considered that," I said. "But the information I found came from church sources. The Gospel Topics essays are published by the church itself. Those essays exist to provide context for complex history. They're meant to strengthen testimony, not destroy it. If you're reading them and feeling doubt instead of peace, that tells me something about your approach, not about the essays." I wanted to ask what approach could make a 37-year-old man marrying a 14-year-old girl feel acceptable. But I held my tongue. "What I'd suggest," he continued, "is a period of intense spiritual focus, daily scripture study, especially the Book of Mormon, fasting every week, prayer multiple times a day. And I'd recommend you meet with a church counselor. Brother Patterson in our stake has helped many people through faith crises." "And my questions, the historical issues?" "Put them on the shelf. Focus on what you know, not what you don't know. Remember the spiritual experiences you've had. Focus on your testimony." I almost laughed. My testimony was exactly what had collapsed. The spiritual experiences I had interpreted as witnesses of the church's truth now seemed like something else entirely. Emotional responses, confirmation bias, the product of a lifetime of conditioning. But I nodded because Linda was watching me with desperate hope, and I couldn't bear to take that away from her. Not yet. "I'll try," I said. Bishop Morrison smiled, relieved. "That's all the Lord asks. Try and trust Him to do the rest." We scheduled weekly meetings. I was given a stack of books, apologetic works that supposedly addressed the historical issues. I was assigned to reread the Book of Mormon, looking for evidence of its truth. I was encouraged to fast, pray, and attend the temple as often as possible. I did all of it. For 2 weeks, I followed the program perfectly. I read the apologetic books, which explained away each problem with increasingly convoluted logic. I fasted until I was dizzy. I prayed until my knees ached. I attended the temple 3 times, sitting through the endowment ceremony and trying to feel something beyond the creeping sense of absurdity. Nothing changed. The doubts didn't go away. The questions didn't resolve. If anything, the more I tried to force belief, the more hollow it became. Faith, I was discovering, was not something you could manufacture through willpower. It was not a muscle you could strengthen with exercise. Either you believed or you didn't, and all the scripture reading in the world couldn't make a fiction become true. Linda watched me closely during those 2 weeks. She wanted so badly to see improvement, to believe that her husband was finding his way back to the fold. I tried to give her hope. I said the right things, made the right faces, attended all the right meetings. But she knew me too well. She could see the emptiness behind my eyes. At the end of the 2nd week, she sat me down in the living room after the children had gone home from Sunday dinner, a dinner that had been notably smaller, with only Megan and Daniel attending. David and Sarah had not come. They had not responded to my calls or texts. "It's not working, is it?" Linda's voice was flat, not angry anymore, just exhausted. "No. You don't believe anymore." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I don't know what I believe. But I know I can't force myself to believe something that doesn't make sense to me." She closed her eyes. A single tear ran down her cheek. "What do you want me to do, Richard? I've been married to you for 31 years. We're sealed for eternity. Our children, our grandchildren, our whole family is built on the gospel. If you leave, what happens to all of that? I don't know. I can't be married to an apostate. Her voice cracked on the word. I can't spend every Sunday sitting alone in church explaining to the Relief Society why my husband isn't there. I can't have my grandchildren asking why Grandpa doesn't believe anymore. I can't. She stopped, pressed her hands to her face, and sobbed. I reached for her, but she pulled away. Don't. Not right now. We sat in silence for a long time, the space between us feeling wider than it ever had. You have 60 days, she finally said, her voice steadier now. 60 days to figure this out. Go to the counselor, do the work, pray like you've never prayed before. If you can find a way back, anyway, I'll be here. But if you can't... She took a shaky breath. I'll file for divorce. I won't spend the rest of my life married to someone who doesn't share my faith. Linda, I'm still the same person. My values haven't changed. I still love you, still love our family. But you don't believe, and belief is everything. Without it, what are we? I didn't have an answer. That night she moved into the guest bedroom. We were still married, still living in the same house, but there was a wall between us now. Invisible, impenetrable. I lay alone in our bed for the first time in decades, staring at the ceiling, counting the days until my world finished falling apart. The 60-day deadline hung over me like a guillotine. I continued meeting with Bishop Morrison, continued attending church, continued going through the motions. But I also started doing something else, something I kept secret from Linda. I found a group, a support group for people going through what they called a faith transition. They met every Thursday evening in a coffee shop in Salt Lake City, an hour's drive from Provo. The first time I walked in, my hands were shaking. I half expected lightning to strike me down for entering a building that served coffee. But instead of judgment, I found compassion. There were about 15 people there that first night, men and women, young and old, all of them former believers struggling to rebuild their lives. They understood things that no one in my world could understand. They knew the specific pain of losing a faith that had defined every aspect of existence. They knew the grief, the anger, the confusion, the strange liberation that came with finally being honest. One woman, a former Relief Society president named Carol, told me something that first night that I've never forgotten. The hardest part isn't losing God, she said. It's losing yourself. You spend your whole life being a Mormon, and then suddenly you're not, and you have no idea who you are without it. She was right. I had been Richard Ballard, faithful member, priesthood holder, temple worker, husband, father, grandfather. Remove the church from that identity and what was left? I didn't know. I had never been allowed to find out. The group taught me terms I had never heard. Shelf-breaking, when the accumulation of doubts and questions finally becomes too heavy to ignore. PIMO, physically in, mentally out, describing people who continued attending church despite no longer believing. Tapir, a joking reference to apologetic attempts to explain away Book of Mormon anachronisms. They had a whole vocabulary for the experience I was going through, a whole community of people who had survived it. For the first time in weeks, I felt slightly less alone. I attended every Thursday. I listened more than I talked, absorbing stories that mirrored my own. A former bishop who discovered the truth about polygamy. A returned missionary who studied Egyptian and realized the Book of Abraham was fiction. A lifelong member whose daughter came out as gay, forcing her to confront the church's treatment of LGBTQ people. Each story was different, but the themes were the same: discovery, devastation, and the long, slow process of rebuilding. The 60 days passed faster than I expected. I did everything Linda asked: the counseling, the scripture study, the temple attendance. But I didn't find my way back. I couldn't manufacture belief where none existed, and when the deadline arrived, we both knew what was coming. She filed for divorce on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home from work to find the papers on the kitchen table, her signature already in place. She was sitting in the living room, her bags packed, her face composed into a mask of determined calm. "My sister's coming to pick me up," she said. "I'll stay with her until we can work out the details." "Linda, please. We've been married for 31 years. Can we at least try counseling, secular counseling, where we can talk about this honestly?" "Honestly?" A flash of anger crossed her face. "You want to talk honestly? You've been lying to me for months, Richard. Going through the motions, pretending to try while meeting with your little apostate group in Salt Lake." My stomach dropped. Did you think I wouldn't find out? This is Utah. Everyone knows everything. Sister Peterson saw you at that coffee shop, sitting with a group of people she recognized from the ex-Mormon forums. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was for me? To hear it from someone in my ward instead of from my own husband? I was trying to find support, people who understood what I was going through. There's support in the church. There are resources. But you didn't want support. You wanted validation for your doubt. You wanted people to tell you it was okay to throw away everything we built. I didn't know what to say. She wasn't entirely wrong. I had wanted validation. I had needed to hear that I wasn't crazy, that my questions were legitimate, that there was life on the other side of faith. "I'm sorry I wasn't more honest with you," I said. "I was scared." "So was I. I still am." Her voice softened for just a moment. "I still love you, Richard. Part of me always will. But I can't be married to someone who doesn't believe. My faith is everything to me. It's who I am. And I'm asking you to be someone I'm not." "Yes, I suppose I am." She stood as a car pulled into the driveway. "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the house and assets. I'm not trying to take everything, I just want this to be as clean as possible." She walked to the door, paused, and looked back at me. For a moment I saw the woman I had married, the young returned missionary with the bright smile and the unshakable faith, the woman I had promised to cherish for time and all eternity. "Goodbye, Richard." The door closed behind her. Through the window, I watched her climb into her sister's car and drive away. I stood there for a long time, watching the empty street, feeling the silence of the house settle around me like a shroud. 31 years of marriage ended in an afternoon. I sat down on the floor, the same floor where I had collapsed during my night of research, and I cried until there was nothing left. Block 03-4, the apartment in Murray was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into a living area barely large enough for a couch and a television. The walls were white and bare. The carpet was beige and stained in places. It smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cigarettes, a scent that no amount of cleaning seemed to eliminate. It was the first place I had lived alone in my entire life. I moved in 3 weeks after Linda filed for divorce. The house in Provo sold quickly, Utah real estate always did, and we split the proceeds down the middle. Fair, clean, efficient, just like Linda wanted. The divorce itself was finalized 2 months later. 31 years of marriage dissolved with a judge's signature and a few pages of legal documents. I kept very little from our old life. Some clothes, some books, a few photographs that Linda didn't want. Everything else went to her or to the children or to Deseret Industries. I didn't fight for any of it. Material possessions seemed irrelevant when your entire identity had been stripped away. The first night in the apartment, I sat on the second-hand couch I had bought from a neighbor and stared at the empty walls. The silence was overwhelming. For 3 decades I had lived in a house full of noise. Children laughing, Linda singing hymns while she cooked, the television playing General Conference, the phone ringing with ward members needing help. Now there was nothing. Just me and the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of cars passing on the street below. I thought about praying. Old habits die hard, and for 54 years prayer had been my reflex response to difficulty. But who would I pray to? The God I had believed in was the God of Joseph Smith, the God of the Restoration, the God who had appeared in a grove of trees to a 14-year-old boy. If that story wasn't true, and I no longer believed it was, then what God was left? Maybe there was still something out there, some force, some consciousness, some organizing principle of the universe. But it wasn't the God I had known. It wasn't the God who answered prayers and guided prophets and cared about whether I drank coffee or wore the right underwear. That God had been a human creation, a character in a story written by men who wanted power and control. I didn't pray that night. I haven't prayed since. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and adjustment. I had to learn how to be a person outside the church, and I discovered that I had no idea how. For 54 years, every aspect of my life had been structured by Mormonism. My social calendar revolved around church meetings. My friendships were all with ward members. My hobbies were service projects and temple attendance. My entire framework for understanding the world, morality, purpose, meaning, death, came from church teachings. Remove all of that, and what remained? I found myself paralyzed by simple decisions. What should I do on Sunday mornings? I had never had a free Sunday in my adult life. What should I eat and drink? The word of wisdom had governed my diet since childhood. How should I spend my money now that I wasn't paying tithing? What should I do with the garments still folded in my drawer, the temple clothes hanging in my closet, the scriptures on my shelf? I started small. I bought a coffee maker. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to use it, and when I finally took that first sip, I half expected to feel something: guilt, pleasure, rebellion. Instead, I just tasted coffee, bitter and unremarkable. All those years of abstinence, all those lessons about the evils of hot drinks, and this was what I had been missing. It seemed almost absurd. But the coffee wasn't really about coffee. It was about choice. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions based on my own judgment rather than institutional mandate. I could drink coffee or not drink coffee, and neither choice had cosmic significance. The universe didn't care. God, if there was a God, had bigger concerns than my beverage preferences. The freedom was terrifying. And gradually, it became liberating. My job at BYU ended quietly, as these things do in Mormon institutions. I wasn't fired. That would have created too much paperwork, too many potential legal issues. Instead, I was invited to a meeting with the dean and the head of HR, where they expressed concern about my faith journey and wondered if I might be happier in an environment that didn't require religious commitment. They offered a generous severance package and a neutral letter of recommendation. The implication was clear: leave voluntarily, or we'll find a reason to remove you. I took the severance. Fighting would have been pointless. BYU required all employees to maintain a temple recommend, and I no longer qualified. More than that, I no longer wanted to work for an institution that demanded ideological conformity as a condition of employment. Let them have their bubble. I was done pretending. Finding a new job at 54 with a resume that screamed Mormon institution was harder than I expected. But I was good at what I did: administration, budget management, institutional planning, and eventually, a state university in Salt Lake offered me a position. Lower pay, less prestige, but no religious tests. No one asked about my underwear or my belief in prophets. They just wanted to know if I could do the job. I could. And for the first time in my career, I was doing it as myself. The hardest part was the children. David, my oldest, stopped speaking to me entirely after the divorce. He had always been the most orthodox of my children, the one who defended the church most fiercely, the one who saw doubt as weakness and questioning as sin. To him, my loss of faith was a betrayal, not just of the church, but of everything he had been taught to value. I had been his role model, his example of righteous manhood. Now I was a cautionary tale. I sent him emails, left voicemails, even wrote a handwritten letter explaining my journey and my continued love for him. He never responded. I learned through Linda that he had told his children, my grandchildren, that Grandpa was sick and needed prayers. Better that than the truth, I suppose. Better to be sick than to be an apostate. Sarah followed David's lead, though with slightly less absolutism. She sent me a text a few weeks after the divorce. "I love you, Dad, but I can't have you around the kids right now. They're too young to understand, and I don't want them confused. Maybe someday when things are different." It was more than David had offered, but it still felt like a door closing. Daniel tried to stay neutral. He called me once a week, usually on Wednesday evenings, and we talked about sports and weather and his job. Everything except religion or the divorce. He was the peacemaker, the one who hated conflict, and I could tell that my situation was tearing him apart. He loved me, but he also loved the church, and he didn't know how to reconcile those loyalties. "I don't understand it, Dad," he said during one of our calls. "I've read some of the stuff you mentioned, the essays, some of the history. It's complicated, I know, but I still feel the Spirit when I pray. I still feel peace when I go to the temple. Doesn't that mean something?" "It means something," I said carefully. "I'm not saying your experiences aren't real. But I've started to think that maybe they're not evidence of what we were taught, they were evidence of." "Then what are they evidence of?" "I don't know. Human psychology, maybe. The power of ritual and community. The brain's response to meditation and contemplation. That doesn't make the experiences less valuable, just less supernatural." He was quiet for a long time. "That's really sad, Dad." "Maybe. Or maybe it's just different. I'm still figuring it out." He didn't bring it up again. Our calls continued, carefully skirting the edges of anything meaningful. I was grateful for them anyway. At least one of my sons hadn't completely shut me out. And then there was Megan. Of all my children, Megan was the one I worried about most, and the one who surprised me most. She had been the quiet one at that fateful Sunday dinner, the one who asked the question about polygamy, and then retreated into silence as the family exploded around her. In the weeks that followed, she stayed in contact with both me and Linda, carefully neutral, refusing to take sides. I assumed she was just being diplomatic, trying to preserve her relationships with both parents. I was wrong. About 2 months after I moved into the Murray apartment, my phone rang late one evening. It was Megan. "Dad, can we talk? I've been reading too." My heart stopped. "Reading what?" "Everything. The CES letter, the essays, the historical documents." "I started right after that dinner. I couldn't stop thinking about your face when you said you didn't believe anymore. You looked so broken, but also relieved, like you had finally put down something heavy." "Megan, I'm not calling to argue or lecture you. I'm calling because I think I understand and I don't know what to do." We talked for 3 hours that night. She told me about her own doubts, which had started years ago but which she had suppressed, shoved onto the shelf, ignored in favor of going through the motions. She told me about her marriage to Jared, who was a true believer and would be devastated if he knew what she was thinking. She told me about her children, being raised in the church just as she had been, learning the same simplified stories she now knew were incomplete. "I feel like a fraud," she said, her voice cracking. "Every Sunday I sit there and teach my kids things I'm not sure are true. I take them to church and smile and sing the hymns, and I feel like I'm lying to them with every breath." I knew exactly what she meant. "What do I do, Dad? Do I tell Jared? Do I keep pretending? Do I blow up my whole life like you did?" "I can't answer that for you," I said. "I can only tell you what I learned. The truth comes out eventually, one way or another. You can control when and how, or you can wait until it controls you, but you can't unknow what you know." She was crying now. "I'm so scared." "I know. I was too. I still am most days. Does it get better?" I thought about my empty apartment, my estranged children, my failed marriage, my lost career. I thought about the loneliness, the grief, the long nights staring at the ceiling. But I also thought about the coffee I drank every morning without guilt. The Sundays I spent hiking in the mountains instead of sitting in meetings. The books I was reading, the ideas I was exploring, the person I was slowly becoming. The freedom to doubt, to question, to change my mind. The freedom to be wrong without eternal consequences. Yeah, I said finally. It gets better. Not easier exactly, but better. More real. More honest. And that's worth something. Megan didn't tell Jared right away. She took her time, did more research, processed her feelings. We talked regularly during those months, sometimes on the phone, sometimes in person when she could get away without raising suspicion. I became her confidant, her guide to the landscape of doubt. It was an unexpected gift, this new relationship with my daughter. We had always been close, but now we were connected by something deeper. The shared experience of having our world collapse and having to rebuild it from scratch. When she finally told Jared, it didn't go well. But it didn't go as badly as it might have. Jared was hurt, confused, scared, but he loved Megan, and unlike Linda, he wasn't willing to let religion destroy his marriage. They went to counseling, not LDS counseling, but real therapy with a licensed professional who didn't have a doctrinal agenda. Slowly, painfully, they started to rebuild. The last I heard, they were still together, still figuring it out. Jared still attended church, and Megan went with him sometimes for the community and the family connections. But she no longer believed, and Jared knew that, and they had found a way to live with the difference. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that Mormonism promised, but it was real, and real, I was learning, was better than perfect. 6 months after the divorce, I started therapy. Not religious counseling, not faith crisis coaching, but actual psychological therapy with a licensed counselor who specialized in religious trauma. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Chen, and she had worked with dozens of former Mormons, former Jehovah's Witnesses, former evangelicals, anyone who had lost a high-demand faith and was struggling to rebuild. In our first session, she asked me to describe my experience, and I talked for nearly an hour straight. She listened without judgment, occasionally nodding, taking notes. When I finally ran out of words, she looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize at first. Compassion. Simple, uncomplicated compassion. What you're experiencing is grief, she said. You've lost something enormous. Your belief system, your community, your marriage, your relationships with your children. You've lost your identity and your sense of purpose. That's a massive amount of loss to process, and it makes sense that you're struggling. I feel like I should be over it by now. It's been months. Grief doesn't have a timeline, especially this kind of grief. You spent 54 years building a life around a set of beliefs, and now those beliefs are gone. That's not something you get over in a few months. It takes years sometimes. And even then, you don't really get over it. You integrate it. You build a new life that includes the loss rather than pretending it didn't happen. We met every week for the next year. She helped me understand the psychological mechanisms that had kept me believing for so long. Confirmation bias, sunk cost fallacy, social pressure, the human need for certainty and belonging. She helped me process the anger I felt toward the church for deceiving me, and the guilt I felt for having deceived others in turn. She helped me separate my identity from my former beliefs, to discover who I was beneath the layers of indoctrination. It was hard work. There were sessions where I cried the entire time, sessions where I raged, sessions where I sat in numb silence. But slowly, I began to heal. The gaping wound that had been my faith started to close, leaving a scar that would never fully disappear, but that no longer bled when touched. I learned to meditate without prayer, to find peace without doctrine, to appreciate beauty without attributing it to divine design. I read philosophy, Stoicism, existentialism, Buddhism, secular humanism, and discovered that wisdom existed far beyond the narrow confines of Mormon scripture. I learned that morality didn't require commandments carved in stone, that meaning didn't require a cosmic purpose, that death didn't require an afterlife to be faced with dignity. I was becoming a new person, Or maybe I was becoming myself for the first time. One evening, about a year after the divorce, I drove to Utah Lake and parked near the shore. It was sunset, the sky a riot of orange and pink and purple, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I had been coming here often lately. There was something about the open space, the vastness of sky and water, that helped me think. I walked along the shore until I found a quiet spot, then sat down on a rock and watched the sun sink toward the mountains. A year ago, I had been Richard Ballard, faithful Latter-day Saint, devoted husband, respected church leader. I had known exactly who I was, where I came from, and where I was going. My life had been mapped out with divine precision. Mortality was a test, death was a transition, eternity was a reward for obedience. Now I was something else, something unnamed and uncertain. I no longer knew if there was a God or an afterlife or any cosmic meaning to existence. I no longer had the comfort of prophetic guidance or scriptural certainty. I was alone in a universe that might be entirely indifferent to my existence. And somehow that was okay. Not good exactly. Not happy. But okay. Bearable. Even in moments like this, beautiful. I watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the peace the church had promised, the peace that came from obedience and conformity and the suppression of doubt. A different kind of peace, the peace of acceptance, the peace of no longer fighting against reality, the peace of admitting that I didn't have all the answers and might never have them, and that was all right. I thought about the laws of the universe, not the commandments I had been taught in church, but the actual patterns that governed existence. Cause and effect, my search for truth had led to the loss of my old life, but also to the possibility of a new one. Rhythm and cycles. I had experienced destruction, and now I was in the process of rebuilding. Polarity, the pain of losing my faith was inseparable from the freedom of no longer carrying it. These weren't divine revelations. They were simply observations about how life worked, but they felt truer to me than any scripture I had ever read. I sat by the lake until the stars came out, then drove home to my small apartment in Murray. It was still sparse, still quiet, still a far cry from the house in Provo where I had raised my family. But it was mine, and I was learning slowly to make it feel like home. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think, feel, or remember your own journey, I'd be grateful if you'd consider supporting this channel. There's a link in the description and pinned comment where you can buy me a coffee. Every contribution helps keep these stories alive and reaching people who need to hear them. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, about 14 months after the divorce. I was making dinner, pasta with marinara sauce, nothing fancy, when my phone buzzed. The screen showed Megan's name. I answered, expecting our usual chat about the kids or her ongoing negotiations with Jared about church attendance. Instead, I heard her crying. "Megan, what's wrong? Is everyone okay?" "Everyone's fine, She took a shaky breath. "I just got off the phone with Mom." My stomach tightened. Linda and I hadn't spoken directly since the divorce was finalized. All communication went through lawyers or occasionally through the children. What happened? "She's getting remarried, to Brother Jensen from her ward, the one who's been a widower for the past 3 years. I sat down heavily on the kitchen chair. "Already?" "They've been dating for 6 months, apparently. She didn't tell any of us until now because she wanted to make sure it was serious." Megan laughed bitterly. "It's serious, all right. They're getting sealed in the temple next month." Sealed. Another eternal marriage contracted in a building I was no longer allowed to enter, by an authority I no longer recognized. Linda would stand across the altar from another man, make the same covenants she had made with me 32 years ago, and I would be erased from the eternal equation. "Dad, are you still there?" "I'm here." "Are you okay?" Was I okay? I didn't know. I had expected this on some level. Linda was young enough to remarry, faithful enough to want a temple ceiling, attractive enough to have options. Brother Jensen was a good man from what I remembered, a retired accountant with a gentle demeanor and an unshakable testimony. He would be good to her. He would be the husband I couldn't be. I think so, I said slowly. It's strange. I thought I would feel more something. Jealousy maybe, or anger, but mostly I just feel tired. She wants us all to be there, at the ceiling. Even you, she said. Well, not inside, obviously, but at the reception after. That's kind of her. Will you go? I thought about it, standing in a church cultural hall eating funeral potatoes and pretending to be happy while my ex-wife started a new eternal family without me. Smiling at ward members who whispered about my apostasy when they thought I couldn't hear. Watching my children navigate the awkwardness of having their father present at their mother's wedding to another man. I don't think so, I said. It wouldn't be fair to anyone. Tell her I wish her well. I mean that sincerely. I'll tell her. We talked for a while longer, about Megan's kids, about Jared's latest attempts to understand her perspective, about nothing in particular. After we hung up, I sat in the darkening kitchen and stared at the wall. Linda was getting sealed to another man. The eternal family we had built together, the ceiling that was supposed to bind us for time and all eternity, was being dissolved, replaced, overwritten. In the eyes of the church, I would become a footnote in her history, the wayward first husband who had lost his way, and somehow I was okay with that. Not happy, not indifferent, but okay. At peace even. Because the ceiling had never been real. The eternal family had been a beautiful idea, a comforting story, but it was based on premises I no longer accepted. Linda deserved to be happy, and if Brother Jensen and a temple ceiling gave her that happiness, then I wished her well. I had my own life to build now, my own happiness to find, and it wouldn't come from clinging to a past that no longer existed. Bloco 4-4. 2 years after my night of research, I received an unexpected visitor. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October, the trees turning gold and red, the air carrying that crisp bite that signaled winter's approach. I was reading on my small balcony, a book about Stoic philosophy, something that would have been forbidden in my old life, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Megan usually called before coming over, and my other children still weren't speaking to me. I set down the book and went to answer. Daniel stood in the hallway looking uncomfortable. He was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, the universal Mormon offering of peace. Hey, Dad. Daniel. This is a surprise. Yeah, He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Can I come in? I stepped aside and let him enter. He looked around the apartment, taking in the sparse furniture, the books on secular philosophy and science stacked on every surface, the coffee maker prominently displayed on the kitchen counter. I saw him notice the coffee maker and quickly look away. Sarah made this, he said, holding up the casserole. Chicken and rice. She wanted you to have it. Sarah? My estranged daughter who hadn't spoken to me in 2 years? She's not ready to see you yet, but she wanted you to know she's thinking about you. He set the dish on the counter. We all are. I didn't know what to say. I gestured toward the couch, and we both sat down. The silence stretched between us, filled with 2 years of things unsaid. How are you, Dad? Daniel finally asked. Really? I'm okay. Better than I was. I have a job I like, a therapist who helps, some friends from the support group. It's not the life I planned, but it's a life. He nodded slowly. You look different. Different how? I don't know. Calmer, maybe. Less heavy. He paused. When I was a kid, I always thought you had everything figured out. You were so certain about everything. The church, the gospel, right and wrong. It was reassuring, you know, having a dad who knew all the answers. I didn't know the answers. I just thought I did. I'm starting to realize that. He took a deep breath. I've been reading, Dad. Not as much as you, not the CES Letter or anything like that, but the gospel topics essays, some of the historical stuff, and I have questions now. Questions I don't know how to answer. My heart ached for him. I knew exactly what he was going through. The confusion, the fear, the sense that the ground was shifting beneath your feet. What kind of questions? The polygamy stuff, mostly. And the Book of Abraham. And just the way the church handles things, the secrets, the excommunications, the way they treat people who doubt. He rubbed his face with his hands. I still believe, Dad. I think. I still feel something when I pray, when I go to the temple. But it's not as simple as it used to be. It never is once you start looking. How do you do it? How do you live without knowing, without certainty? I thought about the question carefully. It was the same question I had asked myself countless times over the past 2 years. You learn to be comfortable with not knowing, I said finally. You learn that uncertainty isn't the enemy. It's just the truth of the human condition. Nobody really knows, Daniel. Some people pretend they do, and that pretending can feel like faith. But real wisdom is admitting the limits of what we can know and making peace with the mystery. That sounds lonely. Sometimes it is, but it's also honest. And there's a kind of peace in honesty that I never found in certainty. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, I'm not leaving the church, at least not right now. Emily and the kids, it's their whole world. I can't just pull the rug out from under them. I understand, but I wanted you to know that I don't think you're evil, or deceived by Satan, or any of the things people say about apostates. His voice cracked slightly. I think you're just a man who looked for truth and found something you didn't expect, and I respect that, even if I can't follow you there. I felt tears forming in my eyes. This was more than I had hoped for. This was my son, reaching across the chasm that divided us, offering what connection he could. Thank you, Daniel. That means more than you know. He stood up to leave, and I walked him to the door. Before he stepped out, he turned and hugged me. It was the first time we had embraced since the divorce. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. He walked down the hallway, and I watched him go until he disappeared around the corner. Then I closed the door and leaned against it, letting the tears fall freely. Something had shifted. Not everything was healed. David still wouldn't speak to me. Sarah was only reaching out through casseroles, and the grandchildren I had helped raise were growing up without me. But Daniel had built a bridge. A small one, fragile and tentative, but a bridge nonetheless. It was more than I had dared to hope for. The months that followed brought small changes, gradual and almost imperceptible. Sarah started texting me occasionally. Nothing deep, just updates about the kids, photos of school events, the mundane details of family life. She wasn't ready to see me in person, but she was no longer pretending I didn't exist. Progress. David remained silent, but his wife, Michelle, reached out once to tell me that the grandchildren asked about me sometimes. He tells them you're on a different path, she said, and that you still love them. I thought you'd want to know. It wasn't much, but it was something. Megan and I grew closer than ever. She had found her own equilibrium, still attending church occasionally with Jared, still raising her children with some Mormon traditions, but no longer believing the literal truth claims. She called it cultural Mormonism, a way of maintaining community and family connections without intellectual dishonesty. I wasn't sure it was sustainable long-term, but it was working for her, and that was enough. I started dating, tentatively and awkwardly. At 56, I had no idea how to navigate romance outside the Mormon framework of eternal marriage and temple ceilings. I went on a few coffee dates with women from the support group or from dating apps, but nothing clicked. I was still too raw, too uncertain of who I was becoming, to offer myself to another person. That was okay. There was time. For the first time in my life, I wasn't operating on a divine timeline. There was no celestial deadline, no eternal consequence to being alone. I could take as long as I needed. 3 years after my night of research, I returned to Provo. Not to stay. I had no desire to live in the shadow of the temple again, but to visit. An old colleague from BYU was retiring, and despite everything, I wanted to pay my respects. He had been kind to me during my quiet departure, one of the few who had treated my faith crisis with compassion rather than judgment. The reception was held at a church building, of course. Everything in Provo happened at church buildings. I hesitated in the parking lot, feeling the old familiar weight of those walls, the memories of thousands of hours spent inside similar structures. Then I took a breath and walked in. The cultural hall was crowded with people I had known in my former life. Faculty members, ward members, stake leaders. Some of them looked at me with curiosity, others with pity, a few with barely concealed hostility. I smiled and nodded and made small talk, playing the role of the gracious former colleague who had simply moved on to other opportunities. Near the refreshment table, I saw him, Tyler Erickson. He was older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes still held that same calm certainty I had seen in the disciplinary council 3 years ago. He was talking to a young woman I didn't recognize, and when he saw me looking, he excused himself and walked over. "Brother Ballard," he said, and there was no sarcasm in the title, just a kind of gentle acknowledgement of our shared history. "I heard about your journey. I'm sorry for what you've lost." "Are you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You warned me that day in the council. You asked if I had read the essays. Part of me has wondered if you knew what would happen." He shook his head. "I didn't know. I hoped you would never have to go through it. I hoped your shelf would hold." He paused. "But I'm not surprised it didn't. You were always too honest for your own good, Richard. It's why you were a good leader. And it's why the truth eventually caught up with you." "Was it worth it?" I asked. "Losing everything?" He thought about it for a long moment. "Ask me that question 5 years from now or 10. The answer keeps changing." He smiled slightly. "But I'll tell you this. I sleep better now than I ever did as a believer. There's something to be said for that." We talked for a while longer, exchanging contact information, promising to stay in touch. Before he left, he shook my hand and said something I've never forgotten. "Welcome to the other side, Richard. It's not what they told us it would be, but it's real, and real is better than perfect." I think about that phrase often. Real is better than perfect. The Mormon Church offered perfection, or at least the promise of it. A perfect plan, a perfect prophet, a perfect path to eternal life. All you had to do was obey, believe, conform, and everything would work out in the end. It was a beautiful story, comforting, reassuring, but it wasn't real. The real story was messier. A church founded by a man with serious moral failings, built on texts that didn't survive historical scrutiny, maintained through information control and social pressure. A community that provided genuine connection and support, but at the cost of intellectual honesty and personal authenticity. A system that worked beautifully for those who never looked too closely and crumbled for those who did. I looked too closely. And yes, it cost me almost everything. My marriage of 31 years, my career at the institution I had served for decades, the respect of my community, the relationship with 3 of my 4 children, the grandchildren I had expected to help raise, the certainty that had structured my entire existence. But here's what I gained: the freedom to think my own thoughts without checking them against official doctrine, the ability to say, "I don't know," without feeling like a failure, the joy of discovering ideas and perspectives that Mormonism had never allowed me to consider, the deep, honest connection with my daughter Megan, built on shared experience rather than shared performance, the slow rebuilding of bridges with Daniel and Sarah, the peace of no longer defending the indefensible, the freedom to be wrong, the freedom to doubt, the freedom to change my mind, the freedom to be human. I still go to Utah Lake sometimes, usually at sunset. I sit on the same rock where I sat during my darkest days, and I watch the light change over the water. I don't pray. I still don't know who or what I would pray to, but I do something that feels similar. I reflect. I breathe. I allow myself to feel whatever I'm feeling without judgment. Sometimes I feel grief for the life I lost. Sometimes I feel anger at the institution that shaped me with incomplete information. Sometimes I feel guilt for the things I taught others, the testimonies I bore, the doubts I dismissed in people who trusted me. But mostly, I feel something like gratitude. Not gratitude to God, I'm still not sure about God, but gratitude for the experience of being alive, for the beauty of the sunset, for the complexity of the universe, for the improbable chain of events that led to my existence, for the capacity to wonder, to question, to grow, to change. I spent 42 years believing I had all the answers. I spent one night discovering I had none. And I've spent the years since learning to live in the space between certainty and doubt, finding meaning without doctrine, building connection without conformity. It's not the life I planned. It's not the life I was promised. But it's mine, truly mine, for the first time. The other night, I was having dinner with Megan and her family. Jared has softened over the years. He still believes, but he's learned to love his wife more than his need for her to share his faith. The kids are growing up with a more nuanced view of religion than I ever had, exposed to both belief and doubt, trusted to find their own way. After dinner, my youngest grandchild, Sophie, climbed into my lap. She's 5 years old, curious about everything, constantly asking questions. "Grandpa," she said, "Mommy says you don't go to church anymore." "How come?" I looked at Megan, who nodded almost imperceptibly. We had discussed this. She wanted her children to know their grandfather, to understand that good people could believe different things. "Well," I said carefully, "I used to go to church because I believed the stories they told there, but then I learned some things that made me think the stories might not be true, so I stopped going." Sophie considered this with the seriousness that only a 5-year-old can muster. "What kind of things?" "Complicated things. Things that are hard to explain to someone your age. But here's what I want you to know. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to wonder if something is true. And it's okay to change your mind when you learn new things. That's not bad or wrong. That's how we grow." She nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay, Grandpa." Then she wiggled off my lap and ran to play with her siblings, the conversation already forgotten. But I sat there for a long time thinking about what I had said. It's okay to ask questions, it's okay to wonder, it's okay to change your mind. These simple truths, which should be obvious, had been revolutionary for me. The church I grew up in didn't encourage questions. It tolerated them barely, as long as they led to approved answers. Doubt was something to be overcome, not explored. Changing your mind was evidence of weakness, not growth. I had spent 54 years in that environment, and it had taken a single night of honest inquiry to bring it all crashing down. But in the ruins, I had found something I never expected. A better way to live. A more honest way. A more human way. I lost 42 years of belief in one night. I lost my wife, my job, 3 of my children, my community, my identity. The cost of truth was almost more than I could bear. But I found something too. I found the freedom to be wrong, to doubt, to change my mind. I found the freedom to explore ideas without fear of eternal consequences. I found a daughter who became my closest friend, a son who built a bridge across the chasm, another son and daughter who are slowly, tentatively, finding their way back to me. I found the ability to sit with uncertainty, to say, "I don't know," without shame, to marvel at the mystery of existence without needing to solve it. I found peace. Not the peace of answers, but the peace of acceptance, the peace of no longer fighting against reality, the peace of being, finally and fully, myself. Some people will say I was deceived by Satan, by the internet, by my own pride. Maybe they're right. I can't prove them wrong any more than they can prove themselves right. That's the nature of faith. It exists beyond the reach of evidence, in a realm where certainty is always an illusion. But I know this. I looked for truth, and I found something I didn't expect. I asked questions, and the answers led me away from everything I had believed. I followed the evidence where it led, even when it led to places I never wanted to go. That's not deception. That's not pride. That's just honesty. Painful, costly, liberating honesty. Would I do it again, knowing what I know now? Knowing the price I would pay? Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because real is better than perfect. And I would rather live one day in truth than a lifetime in comfortable illusion. The sun is setting over Utah Lake as I finish this story. The sky is painted in shades of orange and gold, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. It's beautiful, not because God made it beautiful, but because beauty exists and I have eyes to see it. I don't know what happens when we die. Maybe there's something beyond this life, some continuation of consciousness, some reunion with those we've loved. Maybe there isn't. Maybe this is all there is, this brief flicker of awareness in an indifferent universe. Either way, I'm at peace. I've lived, I've loved, I've lost, I've learned, I've grown. I've made mistakes and tried to make amends. I've hurt people and been hurt by them. I've experienced joy and sorrow, certainty and doubt, faith and its absence. I've been human, and in the end, that's enough. It has to be, because it's all any of us really have. To anyone listening who is where I was 3 years ago, standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the ruins of everything you believed, wondering if you have the courage to jump, you do. It will hurt. It will cost you things you never wanted to lose. But on the other side of the pain, there is something waiting. Not paradise, not perfection, just life. Real, messy, uncertain, beautiful life. And real is better than perfect. I promise you. Real is better than perfect.